Whatever happened to Nemesis? We've talked about this before, but that is 3 seasons ago now, so I figured it was time for an update. Today we're going to look into Nemesis, how she developed in the meta, how she got to the place that she's currently in, which is not the best one right now, and how that could happen, what led to it, and how that maybe could also be prevented in the future. In order to do that, let's start at the very beginning. We're going to look at some things more in depth and some things more a little bit on the surface, so we get a better picture of what were the most relevant things for her. When Nemesis was released, she was basically broken. She was a warrior at the time and she had incredibly strong stats all around, especially her abilities were super strong. Her reflect was much better than it is now, and as such, she was a god that quickly needed quite a few nerfs to be put in line more with other gods. At the start of Season 1, she was reclassified as an assassin with all her stats being changed. After that, she wasn't really touched for a while, though there were still a lot of changes that affected her, which led to her popularity steadily drop until late Season 2. One of the big factors that contributed, and that you can kind of even feel today, was the removal of Hand of the Gods. Hand of the Gods, for those of you who have not been around for that, was an active, what is a relic nowadays, back then, which would allow you to hit multiple minions while being on a very low cooldown. So this was a tool to clear very quickly, especially in jungle, but even in solo, and it was a very core item on Nemesis. Other jungles worked much better without this item, while Nemesis Clear, due to her relatively low base stats on her damaging abilities, was just too weak to keep up with them. At the same time, she didn't benefit as much from other relics, and this is actually still true today. Other gods just do much better with other relics. For example, think of a Serket with Blink. For her it's a high aggression relic, and right now Blink is very popular. For Nemesis, Blink really is more of a crutch to deal with enemies having Blink, because her kit is not necessarily one that requires Blink. She has slows to close the distance, and I guess you can use Blink to engage, but if there was another item that worked better for her, she would probably gladly take it. And back then that was not only Hand of the Gods, but also the upgrade version. So in early game you would use Hand of the Gods to have a better clear, but in later stages of the game you would upgrade to Fist of the Gods. And Fist of the Gods was an item that gave you a 1-second stun on enemies, so it was a free extra CC in your kit. As Nemesis didn't have any hard CC, this really helped her. It was also kind of a counter to her because it was a way to remove her shield, but it was more beneficial to her than it was used against her by most gods, because most other assassins simply have other hard CC to remove the shield anyways. It was only a few niche cases where that mattered, for example with Bakasura. So Nemesis lost her most beneficial relic for both clearing and aggressing, but that wasn't all. Around that time there was also the option to go for a potion of physical might start, where you could buy it in early game for super high aggression. Nemesis did not benefit from that meta either, because she simply isn't, or especially wasn't, a high aggression god for the early game stages. And as such, she once again fell behind the other jungles, which kind of indirectly nerfed her too. Then Concise was also nerfed, which was an incredibly strong item on Nemesis, definitely a core item on her. It was generally a very strong item as well, so the nerfs were understandable, but for Nemesis in particular, they hit her kind of hard. And then Magi's Blessing, now Magi's Cloak, was also nerfed, which was a super strong item on Nemesis, as back then the bubble had a relatively short cooldown and it would prevent enemies from clearing off your shield as well. It was basically the only way to make sure that you can keep your shield on you unless somebody uses multiple CCs after each other, hard CC specifically. So naturally, with all these complications coming to her, Nemesis dropped down in the meta. And Hi-Rez did some smaller changes to combat that, but the real big changes came around Season 3. And Season 3 patch 3.1, Divine Judgment, her ultimate, got its cooldown reduced from 90 to 70 seconds. There are also some other changes, but they weren't really as impactful. In patch 3.8, after she still wasn't performing as well as Hi-Rez was hoping for, the power gain and loss from Scales of Fate from her passive was increased by 2%. Once again, only the minor change, but the bigger change here was the Divine Judgment got its protection seal increased from 30 to 50% to 50% at all ranks, making it much scarier on early levels. Now if you look at these two changes combined, you can kind of guess what these changes led to. With her ultimate being on a lower cooldown and being stronger in terms of protection steal, she performed very well, and her ult had to be nerfed again. She was basically an ult bot, so in patch 3.17, the ult cooldown was increased again from 70 seconds to 90, scaling down to 70 seconds. Furthermore, one patch later, the damage of the ult was reduced from 30 to 50% of the target's current health to 20 to 40% of the target's current health, and the slow as well as the movement speed buff to herself were decreased from 25% at all ranks to 15, scaling up to 25%. After that, it was a bit of a bumpy ride for Nemesis, and I will have to say that at this point not even all data is available anymore as to how she performed when, but she definitely had her ups and downs throughout, and often the issue was still in the fact that she was more of an ult bot. There were a lot of attempts that were made to make her viable in different ways. Often you would see builds with Stone Cutting Sword, you would even see something like Sunder being ran on her for maximum protection shred, and sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. The big thing to take away here is that eventually Hi-Rez got fed up with her identity as an ult bot, and they overhauled various parts of her kit, and that was in patch 4.13. Swift Vengeance got its scaling increased and was now almost on level with Slice and Dice. Slice and Dice had its base damage as well as the scaling increased, and the slow reduced on the other hand from 30 to 50 to just 30% flat, while Divine Judgment, the ultimate, got its protection shred reduced from 50% to 30%. As such, there was a shift not only in her focus on the ultimate, but also in her early game clear, which was still not the best, but definitely improved over what it used to be. But the long-term outcome again wasn't what Hi-Rez was hoping for with all the changes. She was not quite free from her chains of being an ult bot just yet, and that was due to certain combinations of items that became way too effective. You would, especially towards the beginning of Season 5, often see builds that combined Heartseeker, Crusher, and sometimes even a certain version of Malice that was out in February that would give extra damage to an ability. At its peak, that meant that Nemesis could literally one-shot a level 20 squishy that had no defense with just her ultimate, and after that video made its circulations, there were some decisions to be made to nerf her once again. So in patch 5.4 in March 2018, her self buff on the ultimate was again decreased from 8 to 5 seconds, and the cooldown of the ability was increased from 90 to 70 seconds to again 90 seconds at all ranks. So we're going a few steps back in terms of the patch changes here. We've already seen these changes being made the other way around. But obviously that wasn't enough because her burst was still insane, so in April, Divine Judgment got another nerf, decreasing the damage from 20 to 40% to 20 to 30% of the target's current health. The reason why Hi-Rez even waited with these further changes was because in the March nerf, they had already nerfed Heartseeker from 100% scaling to 80% scaling, and they probably figured that that would take a bit of the edge of this ability. And Malice also got changed in the meantime, so it wouldn't have the same effect anymore. As such, there was a lot of damage taken away from the Insta-Burst combo that she had. She still wasn't quite done, but in May she received another nerf to her Slice and Dice, decreasing the damage from 50 to 170 to 40 to 160. While it sometimes takes a while to actually get a feeling for what impact certain changes had, eventually people felt that she wasn't really worth picking up anymore over other junglers, and that point was reached after all these nerfs. This is why in October in patch 5.18 she got her first buff in a while, increasing Retribution's shield healing from 60 to 100% of damage received to 80 to 100%. Just a small tweak here, to be honest, nothing that drastically changes the character, but something that pushes an ability that hasn't been looked at like the others for quite a while, because normally when it came to adjustments for her, it was always about her damage numbers. Now, right now, Nemesis isn't exactly in a good place. Her world's pick and ban rate was 0%, she was not valued enough to be picked up once, and her win rate in Conquest in Diamond Plus is 47%, so much below the average towards the bottom 10-20-ish gods. Right now, some other gods that are dominating the meta are getting some nerfs, but I don't think it's enough for Nemesis to really find her niche again. I would still prefer a Mercury over a Nemesis, and a Pelé can still counter out her shield very easily, for example. So even when you have a better situation than before, because the most broken gods are not as strong anymore in terms of junglers, Nemesis is still towards the bottom end. And that is because her kit and her design just lost a lot of their appeal. When Nemesis was released, she was a very unique character. She had that then unique damage reflection and shield, she had that power steal, and she had that double mobility. All of that isn't that unique anymore nowadays. We have other gods with multi-part abilities, like for example ZiSotto. We have other gods with multiple mobility abilities like Serket, so that part doesn't really stand out anymore. We have other gods with damage reflect that can do it a lot better, like Kuzumbo. While he doesn't get a shield, he can simply build into much more tanky builds and be effective that way most of the time compared to Nemesis, because he just has base stats that facilitate that. Also, if you want to reflect, you can simply build Shell nowadays. And the same thing goes for Protection Steel. Many gods can simply pick up a stone-cutting sword and have the same effect to some degree. Not as potent as Nemesis does, but at least it's there. So a lot of her kit is just something that you can get on other gods in other ways now, and that I think makes her less interesting by design as well. Her niche was always to be a tank crusher, but in that niche she still has a lot of competition. Kwang can do that very well at the moment especially, and Magicals can generally do that a little bit better in my opinion right now. Serket can do it if it's about a single target that potentially also has healing, where the true damage shines, and Bakasura generally also does it a fair bit better than Nemesis right now, because with him it's not so restricted just to the ultimate, and he can just do it with his Butcher Blades whenever they're up. The role of the somewhat tanky damage avoiding assassin has also been taken over by somebody else, and that is Raven. He simply has the tools to reduce damage with his ultimate and to avoid massive damage with his 2 while getting some mobility that way as well, which I think is often the better draw compared to Nemesis. Sprint is also more popular again, and that obviously counters Nemesis very, very well, and that's always an issue for her. What's nice is that her passive is finally fixed, and now both her in-hand damage and ability damage are increased even against camps, which helps a little bit with your clear, so that's a little bit of an upside. But I do think that Nemesis just needs a good look in terms of where her identity should be placed right now, where Hi-Rez wants her to be, what Hi-Rez wants her to be. She can't really fill the niche of a normal burst assassin, because whenever she does, it's just either too extreme or not effective enough. And it has to be something that works with the rest of her kit, with her power steal, with her reflect and all that kind of stuff. I honestly wouldn't be opposed to the idea of moving her back to the warriors and giving her base stats in that regard that benefit her a little more, because we're getting more and more assassins from the warriors, so might as well send one the other way that really has a design that could fit either niche. Another thing that I always found weird about her is that they added the mechanic to her dash that between the 2 dashes you can use your basic attacks, but only gave you 2 seconds to use the dashes. This is something that often leads to just losing a second dash when you're trying to stick to an enemy, and I find that really annoying, especially with how many other gods have 2 separate mobility abilities. I think extending the duration for the second dash here would be more than fair. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look into Nemesis history, where she was and where she is today, and I hope we see some adjustments to her in the near future. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button with the bell, it really helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.